Okay, now we are moving into the plant kingdom. We're still in domain eukarya because they're all eukaryotic cells. So I'm excited because we're in plants. Woohoo! Let's get started. Okay, so what actually makes a plant a plant? Because remember, originally people used to say, is it vegetable, animal, or mineral? So vegetable would be the plant. And usually it was just thought that they grow out of the ground. That's just about all you had to have to be a plant. But now we categorize them with these various characteristics. They are multicellular, they photosynthesize, obviously we just said they were eukaryotic, they are terrestrial, there are a couple of aquatic plants though, I will throw that caveat in there, and then they display what's called alternation of generation, and I'll explain in detail what that means. So when we look at the phylogeny of plants, they are most closely related to the green algae group called the charophytes. And you can go back to our protists and take a look at that if you'd like to. But here's what's similar to them. Charophytes, as well as land plants, both contain chlorophyll A and B. They store their excess carbohydrates as starch, and they have cellulose in their cell walls. So what makes the land plants different than the charophytes? Particularly looking at their reproductive cycle. So plants protect their zygotes and they nourish the resulting embryo. So some charophytes protect their zygotes in a very basic way, but plants kind of go out of their way to make sure that those zygotes are highly protected. But the charophytes also don't nourish the embryos. Charophytes also have a haploid dominant life cycle, and like I said, plants display an alternation of generation. And so here's the basic of what alternation of generation is. That means that their haploid and diploid stages both are multicellular. Normally, one of those two stages is not. So that's what makes plants unique. So here we go. When we are taking a look at the charophytes, the one on the top here, there's the embryo. And like I said, here's that slight protection, so there is a little coating around it. It is aquatic, so it's not a hard shell that goes around it. And then if you come down to the bottom, this is an embryo of a land plant. So it has a seed with a seed coat, which is very thick to make sure that it doesn't dry out, to make sure it doesn't get crushed. Here's the embryo on the inside. So if you can imagine a plant laying down, like this portion would be the root, and then these two become the leaves right there. And then it also does have what we call an endosperm, and that nourishes the embryo until it can come outside of the seed coat and begin its own photosynthesizing. So here is a look at what we're going to be looking at as far as plants go. And so originally here we have the charophytes that we talked about. They were at one point in time put in Kingdom Plantae. However, they don't have what we call vascular tissue, and they don't have that protection of the embryo like we talked about, and the no nourishment of the embryo. So that's now in the protists. But then from here down we have land plants, and we're going to be talking about non-vascular and vascular that do not produce seeds, and then vascular that do produce seeds. So those are kind of our three categories, and that's where we're headed. So here's a better representation of that. So when we say plants, we're referring to land plants. And like I said, there are aquatic plants as well. We're not really going to get into that really. So whenever I say plants, I am referring to land plants. So our first category is our non-vascular, and those contain the bryophytes. Then we have plants that have vascular tissue but don't produce seeds, they produce spores. And those are our ferns and our lycophytes and what they call the fern allies, or things that are similar to ferns. Our third category are the vascular plants. So they have vascular tissue, and we'll go into detail about what that is. And they do produce seeds, so not spores, but seeds, and those are broken down into our gymnosperms and our angiosperms. So we're going to talk about what challenges land plants face and how they've adapted or been designed to overcome those challenges. So what we're comparing here are particularly algae like the charophytes who live in an aquatic environment, and now we're moving on to land, or comparing it to plants that grow on land and what challenges they may face. So if you take just a second, I want you to think about what's different between those two environments. What challenges might these land plants face? So we're going to go over 4 different challenges that land plants face. The first is obvious, the smaller amount of water that's available. So like I said, we are comparing this to the green algae that live in an aquatic environment. So and related to that is desiccation. So not only is there not as much water available, like if you think in terms of if you were thirsty, for instance, but also just drying out, because now we have wind that will cause evaporation, and so it's one of the things that land plants have to be adapted for. The third is the transport of water and minerals against gravity, because in water you have buoyancy, but once you're on land, now you're fighting gravity, and the taller the plant, the larger that challenge becomes. The fourth is UV radiation. When you're in the water, you do have some UV protection. You know that because if you go to the beach and you stay in the water, like the part of your body that's in the water, like your legs, your stomach, that doesn't get nearly as much sun as the part that is above water, like your forehead or your shoulders. So land plants then have to find UV protection. Okay, so looking at the first problem that we mentioned, small amounts of water that are available now. So plants have adapted various ways of accessing more water. So they have these extensive root systems, and those fall into 3 categories, and then we have an additional 4th component to it. So our root systems can either be tap roots or fibrous roots, and then they also have root hairs on those roots. And then, as we mentioned in our fungal unit, we have a symbiotic relationship with Mycorrhizae. And all of these work to access available water sources. So let's start with our taproots. I showed you a slide earlier of the embryo. Remember we talked about that bottom section that was going to turn into the root? Well, that's called an embryonic radicle. And the radicle is what turns into the first root. It's the first part that emerges from a seed, and that's called the primary root. And that primary root is called a taproot. And some plants only produce the taproots. And so those are ones that you're familiar with, like carrots. That's one large taproot. Radishes are the same. But many also have lateral roots that come out from that original taproot. The second type of root system is a fibrous root system, and this is a network of roots that don't come from branches like lateral roots of the taproot, but all come from the same base, but lots of thinner, kind of more hair-like type roots. So that's your fibrous root system, and we see that a lot in grasses, for instance. And they are in what we call monocots, and we're going to talk about what that means much later. But for now, just know that plants more like grasses tend to have fibrous root systems. So this is cool. Roots also produce what we call root hairs, and so they are modified epidermal cells that grow these elongated portions to them. And so here's an example right here. I believe this is a soybean. So here's the taproot that we talked about, and then all these little root hairs that come off the side. Now, the root hairs are different from lateral roots based on where they arise from. So the root hairs, like I said, are modified epidermal cells. And you'll learn later that lateral roots come from an area that's much further inside the root, called the pericycle, but you don't need to know that yet. You will later. So anyway, so root hairs not only allow for more surface area for water and mineral absorption, but that's also where symbiotic relationships happen with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. If you remember way back when we were in the talking about bacteria, we talked about rhizobium bacteria. That's a nitrogen-fixing bacteria that has a symbiotic relationship with plants that are legumes. So alfalfa, soybean, that sort of thing. So this is what it looks like if you were to take a cross-section of one of those root epidermal cells. So we have the cytoplasm, we have a large vacuole here, here's our nucleus, and here's that extension. That's the root hair. Still has a cell membrane, and it has the cytoplasm flows into there. Typically, you don't have a vacuole within the root hair. Now, keep in mind that our root cells do not have chloroplasts. There's no sense in them having chloroplasts because they're underground, so they don't perform photosynthesis. They don't see any light. So we know that root cells do not contain chloroplast. Okay, so this should look familiar because we talked about this in our fungal unit. So mycorrhizae can either be ectomycorrhizae or they can be endomycorrhizae, which is the one on the right. And if you'll remember, our ectomycorrhizae were part of the Ascomycete family, and the endo were part of the glomeromycota. Sorry, had a little brain stall. So they can either be on the outside of the roots or on the inside, but again, they increase the surface area to volume ratio, allowing for more absorption. So any way that the plant can maximize its ability to absorb nutrients and absorb water, it's going to do that. So that's one of the solutions for our land plants' problem of little water availability. So a quick aside, plants are solving two problems at once with these vast root systems. So not only the water accessibility, which was one of the problems that we put on our list, but the roots also are a strong anchor, so they hold the plant in place so it doesn't get knocked over, and so it provides that stability for the plant. Okay, our second problem was desiccation. We don't want the cells in the plant to dry out now that they are not in an aquatic environment. So plants often have what's called a cuticle, and that is just a wax coating that's relatively impermeable on all the parts of the plant that are above ground. Obviously, we don't want that on the roots because we want it to be permeable to water so that we can absorb as much water as possible, or as necessary, I should say. So if you were to take a leaf and cut it in cross section, then you would see what's over here on the right. It has, how do I say this? Because I'm noticing that we haven't gotten to all these things yet. So this section here, those are called mesophyll cells. And there's two different types, and we're going to talk about that later. But that's where all of the photosynthesizing takes place. And then right here on the top layer and on the bottom layer is our wax cuticle. And that wax cuticle, if you look right here, is this thin layer right above the epidermal cells. Here are our epidermal cells. And again, it's on the top and bottom layer to prevent water from evaporating very quickly out of the leaves or out of the stems, all those plant parts that are above ground. So one thing you may have noticed or may have thought of is when we have a wax cuticle, sometimes that means that that is impermeable to air as well, so it would impede gas exchange. So plants have what we call stomata, which is basically a small pore in the surface of the epidermis, and it allows for gas exchange. So those pores then obviously do not have a wax cuticle on top of them. And so for every stomata, which again remember is basically the hole, so here's our stomata. For every stomata there are 2 guard cells. So this one here and then this one here. And they can, the 2 guard cells together decide when the stomata is open and when it is closed. So most of the time, these stomata, at least on what we call dicot plants, are going to be on the bottom side of the leaf. And the reason for that is because the top side would be more exposed to sun. So if we had holes on that top side, you would be losing so much water through evaporation that it would defeat the purpose. We would be having desiccation all the time. But if it's put on the bottom side, then there's slightly less evaporation and it allows for gas exchange. So why is gas exchange important? Well, if we're photosynthesizing, one of the key components that is required in that is carbon dioxide. So those stomata are where the carbon dioxide enters the plant. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these stomata. Because like I said, this is where carbon dioxide is taken into the plant so that it can photosynthesize and produce sugars. So the amount of stomata that are present on the plant is directly related to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So while it's developing, I should say that. So while a plant is developing, if there is a large concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then there will be a low amount of stomata on the leaves, or on all the green parts basically. So the reason for that is if there's plenty of carbon dioxide available, you just don't need as many openings to gather it. However, if the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is low, then there will be more stomata, a higher density of them on the plant, so that there are more options for collecting that carbon dioxide. So something that's really neat about stomata is their opening and closing is very cyclical. So if you look, at a 24-hour cycle of the opening and closing of stomata, you see that during the day, our stomata are going to be open. During the night, they are closed. Now, what reason can you think of for that? Well, the biggest reason, there are probably many, but the biggest reason is that photosynthesis only happens when the light is present. So that's when you need the carbon dioxide, so the stomata need to be open at that time. At night, there's not enough light present, so the only thing the open stomata would do would be allow for a loss of water without a need for carbon dioxide coming in. So let's talk about these. Plants are so cool. It's amazing to me what they can do while they sit still. They know exactly how to work things. So let's talk a little bit about this. So, and this is a pretty busy slide. First of all, let's look at our leaf cross section. We talked about that all of these green middle cells are called mesophyll cells. Now I have lost my little pointer. There it is. Okay. So we have what's called palisade mesophyll cells and then what we call spongy mesophyll cells. And then just to keep things to where you know where they are, here's our upper epidermis and our lower epidermis, keeping in mind that both of them have a wax cuticle as well. And then we have, here are two stomata, and each stomata again has two guard cells. Here's one, here's two, and our other stomata, here's one, and here's two. So what it looks like if you're looking from the top down is, here is one guard cell, and here is the second guard cell. And in this particular image, the stomata is closed. So what happens in order to open these guard cells is that there is blue light present. Studies have been done where you can look at all the different spectrum of light, and blue light is the trigger to open the guard cells. And then in order to close the guard cells, such as in a time of drought or at night, the hormone abscisic acid, or ABA, is released, and that causes the closing of the stomata. And we're going to talk on the next slide about exactly how that happens. But something that's important for you to know is that there's a sort of currency in plants. If it wants to buy carbon dioxide, it has to release a molecule of water. So one carbon dioxide for one water. So if we look at the whole plant, we know that water is absorbed in the roots. And we talked about all the ways that that happens. And then it's transported up through all the above ground features. And there are stomata among the stems as well, but the predominant place that this happens is in the leaves. So that water is drawn up to the leaves, and it is allowed to evaporate out through the stomata in exchange for a carbon dioxide coming in. So that's how that exchange happens. And so blue light is the trigger to open the stomata, because blue light again is what's used for photosynthesis, and so it opens the stomata because it requires an influx of carbon dioxide. All right, so how does this actually happen? Okay, well, here's what's important for you to know. Each of these guard cells has a very large vacuole, and then what it doesn't show in these images is that it has fibers that are radial fibers that go across the cell like this. And there are a whole lot of them, and they're very strong radial fibers. So when we need to have carbon dioxide and we need the stomata to be open, there is an influx of potassium ions. So when there's an influx, because the potassium ion channel is opened by the blue light photosensor, and so all of these potassium ions flow into the vacuole. And naturally, because of osmosis, water fills in to those vacuoles. Well, when those vacuoles are full, it basically causes an increase in turgidity within these guard cells. And because of those radial fibers, and also because there's a really thick section of the cell wall on the side that's closest to the stomata, it causes the cell to bow out. And when it does that, it leaves an opening between the pair of guard cells. So that opens the stomata. Okay, now what happens when it's nighttime, or if the plant senses that it's really dry out? Because remember, we don't want to lose too much water. Okay, what happens then is, remember ABA was our hormone that kind of signals drought is there, or there's a lack of light. So what that causes is in the membrane, calcium ions to exit, and it also causes the potassium ions to exit out of the vacuole. When it does, again, because of osmosis, water follows. Okay? And then because of the structure of the guard cells, that turgidity is lost, and the guard cell walls kind of just flap back together, closing the stomata. So if you think about if you had balloons, and let's say we put duct tape on the sides where they would potentially touch, is that right? Yes. We blow it up and they bend out away from that tape. Well, when we let the air out, they flop back together, almost like a Ziploc bag. They just kind of come back together, and so that allows for the stomata to close. Okay, we're going to move on to our third problem, which was the transport of water and minerals against gravity. And like I said, the taller the plant, the bigger that problem becomes. So plants have specialized tissues and specialized cells within those tissues that contain particular protein structures that resist gravity. Maybe that's a little bit of a stretch, but they facilitate upward transport of water and minerals, and that's called tracheids. So when we said that these plants have vascular tissue, that is a specialized tissue that's made up of xylem and phloem in order to transport food and water. So the xylem transports water and minerals, and the phloem transports sugar. So within the xylem, there are special cells called tracheids, and that's what facilitates the upward transport of water against gravity. And we have some pictures of that here on the right. So this is what they look like. Sorry, I'm trying to get my pointer here. So they are long tapered cells at the end, and you can see that they kind of stack together. And when they do, they have these pits. And so water flows up and through onto the next one, and because of certain structures, it prevents the water from flowing back down. So here we go. This is a variety of ways that within the tracheids there are specialized proteins that prevent the water from flowing back down the tracheids. So when the water comes up into the roots, it goes in through the vascular tissue, up through the xylem, specifically in these tracheids, all the way up to the leaf. And if you'll remember, at the leaves, the water is exiting. And so if you think about the evaporation that takes place there, that pulls the water column up the plant. And this is how that happens. So you have to remember your chemistry of water to understand how this works. So each particular water molecule sticks to every other molecule because of the laws of cohesion. In addition to that, each water molecule can stick to the side of those tracheids, which are pretty small, based on adhesive bonds. And like I said, at the top where there's a leaf and the water is coming out and leaving the stomata, as it leaves, it's called transpiration, and it pulls the rest of the water up in that direction. And because of adhesion and cohesion, it brings the whole water column up. So that's how the water transport happens against gravity. So looking at the direction of flow, this is just kind of going over what I just said, and I know that this may take a little bit of time to really fully grasp. I would suggest that you probably go over this a few times, look at the diagrams. I do want you to understand how the flow of water goes from the soil all the way up and out through the leaves, and how that process happens. So here we go at the roots, the water and minerals come in, and through adhesion and cohesion, it flows up and then out of the leaves, just like we talked about here, out of the leaves in order for carbon dioxide, sorry I can't write very well, to go in through the stomata. That's that exchange. And that is in the xylem, and particularly those cells called the tracheids help to make sure that it doesn't flow back down. So if we were to do a cross section of the root, for instance, that vascular tissue is in the center of the root. This red right here, that is the xylem. And so if we look up in the stem, this part right here is the xylem. That's where that water is flowing. The other portion that we'll get into detail about later on this diagram has to do with sugars. And I told you that that was the other part of the vascular tissue. That's this outside part here, all these little blue parts to these cones. That is where sugars are transported. So in this particular diagram, most of the sugars are produced up here in the leaves, so they would be transported back down into the roots to supply the roots with sugars, since they don't photosynthesize. But for our purposes today, I want you to understand the water flow throughout the plant. Okay, the next problem that we said they face is UV radiation. Well, why is that a problem? Yes, it can cause sunburn even in plants, and that is why that waxy cuticle serves a secondary purpose. It can protect the leaves from sunburn. But the bigger problem is that UV radiation causes an increase in mutation rates. So in order to guard against that, plants undergo an alternation of generation. So a diploid genome can hide the effect of a single allele that's been mutated. So typically we would say that diploid dominant life cycles are better at least concealing mutations and making sure they don't have deleterious effects. So when we look at this chart right here, you'll notice that this section here is the haploid portion, or the time spent in the haploid portion of the life cycle, whereas the blue is the amount of time spent in the diploid part of the life cycle. So our more simple plants like the mosses spend more time in the haploid phase, and then as we get more and more complex, the time spent in the diploid phase becomes larger. Okay, so I mentioned that plants display what we call an alternation of generation life cycle. And that means that the plants have two alternating multicellular life forms. So these are some terms that you're going to have to become very familiar with in order to understand the rest of the unit on plants. And the first is what we call the gametophyte generation. That is the haploid stage of the life cycle. And that is where gametes are produced, so egg and sperm. The sporophyte generation is the diploid phase, and that's where spores are produced. So, this chart up here lets you understand sort of how that relates to other kingdoms we've been looking at. Compares it to the animal kingdom. So animal kingdom, we have a multicellular diploid stage, particularly like us, in the form that you live in right now, you are a multicellular diploid stage. Animals have a unicellular stage or haploid stage, which basically are the production of your egg and sperm. So eggs and sperm are haploid, but they are only single cellular. In plants, the diploid phase is multicellular, and then so is the haploid stage. So haploid stage being the gametophyte generation, which produces unicellular gametes. This multicellular haploid stage is the sporophyte. I can't type that at all, so there you go. That's my sporophyte. So don't get confused. Gametophyte produces gametes. Sporophyte produces spores. That'll keep you on track. So this is what it looks like. So let's start with something we know. Gametes. Let's talk about that. We'll say that's egg and sperm. That's haploid. It comes together and creates a zygote, which undergoes mitosis to produce a multicellular sporophyte. And then the sporangium portion of the sporophyte undergoes meiosis and produces spores, which are haploid. And of course, the haploid spores undergo mitosis to produce a multicellular gametophyte generation that undergoes mitosis to go back and produce gametes. So the sporophyte generation, that being this one, is dominant in ferns, trees, gymnosperms and angiosperms. And the gametophyte generation is dominant in mosses, or simpler plants. So this is an important distinction. Only the sporophyte generation has vascular tissue. Remember we were just talking about that vascular tissue? It's xylem and phloem. That's what conducts water, minerals, and sugars throughout the plant. Only the sporophyte generation has vascular tissue. Okay, some more terms for you. This is what I tell most people. When we get to plants, you are going to have a lot of new terms, and that's probably, if they're new to you, it's probably because you haven't spent a lot of time talking about plants, which is a shame because plants are really fascinating. But so what I'm asking you to learn, it's like, it might kind of be like speaking a new language, but just like talking about anything, there's terminology that goes with it. So, for instance, when I kayak, you probably don't know what it means if I say, oh, I'm going to boof over here, and then I'm going to drop into this, and then I'm going to do a stern squirt. Like, you probably wouldn't know what that meant, right? Unless you are a whitewater paddler, because there is a vocabulary that goes with it. And that's true of anything. So, as we're talking about plants, you just have to get to know the vocabulary so then we can actually talk about the organisms themselves. Okay, so gametophyte generation, if you'll remember, we said that was the haploid generation, haploid portion of the life cycle, if that helps. And they have a region on the multicellular gametophyte called a gametangia. And they produce the male and female gametes. That's where they're produced. So the male gametangia is called the antheridia, and it produces sperm. The female gametangia is the archegonia, and that's where the eggs are produced. So this is what an alternation of generation life cycle looks like. This is the very basic of every plant life cycle. And the forms may look a little different on each one, but this is the general flow. I will ask you to know this. So let's start with, let's start with our zygote. Okay, so our little baby plant. So here he is, diploid phase, undergoes mitosis, and produces the sporophyte generation. That is the multicellular diploid phase of the plant. And remember, that's the one that has vascular tissue. And a certain portion of it, called the sporangium, undergoes meiosis and produces spores. Well, the spores are haploid, so they do not contain vascular tissue. They germinate, go through mitosis, and they produce the gametophyte generation. This is a haploid, multicellular organism that does not contain vascular tissue. And remember, there can be two portions on the gametophyte generation, or it can be two separate plants depending on the plant. But the male gametangia, remember the gametangia is the portion of the gametophyte that produces the gametes. So the antheridia produces the sperm, the archegonia produces the eggs, and then fertilization happens and we go back to the diploid sporophyte generation. Now, I realize that you may need to stop and hear that over again. I totally understand that. And if you have questions, email me. I'd be glad to talk to you about it. Okay, so let's look at what that means on a real plant. And we're going to do this using a fern because it's sort of the best example. It's the easiest one to understand. So let me grab my highlighter here, or my little pen, and let's start where we did before with the zygote. Okay, so think baby plant, diploid generation, so 2N, and it undergoes mitosis, and it's going to produce this tiny young sporophyte. Now, I'm going to come back to some details on that in a minute. As that sporophyte grows and matures, for us, it looks like fern fronds. Okay, that's the sporophyte generation. Multicellular, diploid, has vascular tissue. That is our mature sporophyte generation. Now, if you've ever seen a fern, on the back side of the frond, on the back side of the leaves, they have the sporangia. And so within that sporangia is where the spores are going to be produced. So they undergo meiosis and produce haploid spores. Now, those spores start to germinate and grow into a multicellular gametophyte generation. So keeping in mind it's haploid, multicellular, does not have vascular tissue. On this, there are the portions that are the gametangia. So we have this section here that's the antheridia. Antheridia produce sperm. And then the archegonia section produces eggs. Okay? And so then fertilization occurs, and our sporophyte generation is going to emerge. Now, in ferns, we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but the sporophyte generation is still dependent on the gametophyte generation. So you notice that it starts coming out of our gametophyte, heart-shaped gametophyte. That is not true of all plants, but it is true of ferns. So make sure that you understand how this life cycle works. I will probably have you label parts of it at some point in time because I really want you to understand alternation of generation. Okay, so let's summarize how these land plants solved the various problems. So lack of water, the solution was roots, root hairs, and mycorrhizae. In order to make sure that they don't dry out, they have cuticles and stoma or stomata. To transport water against gravity, the stoma allows for the water to be pulled up and evaporated, but the tracheids make sure that it doesn't fall back down. And then to solve the problem of UV-induced mutation, there is a diploid dominant sporophyte generation. And we see that what is unique about land plants is the alternation of generation life cycle. Okay, so that's your introduction to plants. We have so much more to talk about, but that's basic enough, and make sure you understand that before moving on, because if you don't, then the next things become more and more complicated. So Please ask me if you have questions, and we'll see you next time.